All right, hey, next week, believe it or not, it's Memorial Day weekend. If you can believe it, next week we're starting a brand new series. It's called By Faith, Saying Yes to God, Even When It Is Scary. So Hebrews chapter 11 lists a bunch of the heroes of the faith. And a lot of these people were called by God to do something that required a big leap of faith, and they were unsure of how it was going to all work out, but they did it anyway, trusting God. So we're going to start that next week, looking forward to that. But today, we are finishing this 7-part series, The Family Struggle Bus. And, one of the questions that I think about a lot, and many of you probably think to yourself, if not out loud, every single day, especially if you've got kids at home, is this: why is parenting so difficult? Amen. Yeah, you were bold enough to say that out loud, but the rest of us were thinking it. Why is parenting so hard? And here's why. Because you and I are raising little sinners. And your little sinners are being raised by adult sinners. Okay? So here's what we know about sin, that sin creates dysfunction. So no matter how good you think your family is, no matter how healthy you believe that your family is, every single family is dysfunctional at some level or another. So I want you to just turn to your neighbor, even if you don't know your neighbor. Just turn to him right now, turn to her right now and say, your family's dysfunctional. Okay? And if you want to, you can even point. This is your opportunity to just say, I think I created a fight right over here between a couple people. But yeah, our families are dysfunctional. And here's another question that you've asked yourself, especially for those of you who are in a very difficult season of parenting, is this: are we destined to live with dysfunction forever? Like if you've got little ones in the house and they're in diapers, you're like in the thick of it right now, and you've shared your heart with other people like, oh, it's so hard. I got to get up in the middle of the night and change the diapers. I got all these little ones. And you said to somebody, does it get any easier? And you know what they say. They say, wait till they're teenagers, right? And then then eventually you get out of that stage because we know time rockets. And eventually you have teenagers. And you're like, all right, does it get any easier? And you talk to somebody who's older and wiser and they have adult children and they say, no, actually, parenting adult children is actually the most difficult part of parenting. So in some ways, the dysfunction, it just never ends, right? Life is just full of sin and it's full of dysfunction. And so dysfunction is here to stay because sin is here to stay until Jesus comes back and makes everything new. But today, I want to kind of give us some hope in the midst of it because there is a solution to your dysfunction. There's a solution to my dysfunction, and it's really just one very powerful truth and one action step that I hope we can apply to our lives so that even in the midst of our dysfunction, we can get a little bit healthier, a little bit more joyful, have a little bit more peace, and we can live for the very purpose for our family life. So, if you're new to church today or you're new to the Bible, you picked a great day to come to church. I know I say that all the time, but it really is true because we're going to start at the very beginning of the Bible with Genesis chapter 1, where God creates the heavens and the earth in 6 days. And he looks at it and he sits back in his hammock, sits back in his rocking chair. And he saw all that he had made, and it was very good. It was good. It was perfect, right? And then he decided to create man and woman. He created them in his image, right? So we're all image bearers of God. And it was good with them too. They had this great relationship, walking in the garden, and they wrote an old hymn about it, and I walked with him, and I talked with him in the garden, right? It was good. And then they were given one rule, right? And you know how sometimes you give your kids that one rule, and that's the one rule that they break immediately? That's what happens with Adam and Eve. They end up breaking that rule, sinning or rebelling against God, and they experience exile. And then they have kids. And there's that extraordinary story in Genesis where Cain and Abel have this moment of sibling rivalry. So if you have kids, you know how painful sibling rivalries can be. Like the one kid takes the other kid's toy, and then the other kid's just sitting there with clenched fists, and he got that look on his face, and you're like, oh, you better not do it. You better not do it. Or the other kid comes home with really good grades on his report card, right? And you're like, wow, great job. You got an A on your test. And the other kid's sitting there like, and it's starting to rise up a little bit. And though you never quoted this verse in the moment, you kind of believed it, or you thought it, or maybe you said essentially this to that kid in the moment of that sibling rivalry: sin's crouching at your door, boy. It desires to get you, but you must master it. In other words, I can see it in your eyes. I can see it in your fists. And you better calm down, and you better not allow sin to master you in the moment. But oftentimes, as we have all experienced, the kid, disregards that, and you have this fight that you have to end up breaking up, because we all have dysfunctional families. And so, the story goes on, and there's more kids, and we discover in Genesis chapter 6 that men began to increase in number on earth. And the more people you get, the more dysfunction you have, right? And so it gets to the point where there's lots of people on the earth, and the Lord saw how great man's wickedness on the earth had become, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil all the time. Whew. Jeremiah 17:9, I quote this verse all the time because the prophet was so right when he said, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it?" I can't understand your heart, and I certainly can't even understand my heart. It is a lot more evil than we care to admit. And so God was grieved that he had made man on the earth, and his heart was filled with pain. And if you're a parent, you've experienced that. Your kids are doing things, and you're like, and your heart just gets filled with grief and filled with pain. And the next verse in Genesis chapter 6, I think I could argue is the most difficult verse in the entire Bible. It's a difficult verse. It's where God says, "I will wipe mankind, whom I have created, from the face of the earth." And isn't it interesting that in our children's Bible, this is one of the main stories, and yet it is the most horrific story in the entire Bible, right? Where God starts over. He chooses this one man, Noah, and his righteous family. And if you're sitting there thinking, that is quite a verse and quite a thing, we're going to talk about this whole story in detail on June 9th when we get into this series, By Faith. But God starts over with mankind, preserves this family, Noah and the ark, and finally the waters recede, and God produces this rainbow, which is a reminder to the people. It's this covenant that God makes with Noah that he will never again flood the earth. And if you don't know the Bible and you're just kind of reading along and you get to this part of the story, you might be thinking to yourself, all right, we're good now, right? Like, now we got Noah, he's a righteous man, his family, and everything's going to work out. It's going to be happily ever after. And then you read Genesis 9, verses 20 to 28. Now, don't read it right now, because this is a crazy story. You can read it when you get home. But what you're going to discover is Noah was also dysfunctional. And his family was dysfunctional. And he produced a bunch of kids who were dysfunctional, and they had kids who were dysfunctional. And eventually you had a whole bunch of people that get together one day, and they say to themselves, let's build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens so that we may make a name for ourselves. And we see that inside the heart of every human is this desire to make a name for ourselves. It's this old thing called pride. And God looks down at them designing this tower and he says, oh no, this is not going to be about you. And so he confuses their language and the people spread out. And it demonstrates this proverb, where the author of Proverbs writes, pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. You might be able to get away with pride for a time. You might be able to get away with pride for a season, but eventually it's going to destroy your family. Matter of fact, he takes it a step further and says this: it's better to be lowly in spirit, or it's better to be depressed. Some of you might be experiencing depression, or if you experienced depression in the past. It's actually better to be depressed and among the oppressed than to share plunder with the proud. And so at the end of Genesis chapter 11, God's got a problem on his hands. He looks at the children whom he has created in his image, and he's got a mess. I got a question for you. If you were God, What would you do if your children were prideful and selfish? I mean, not that any of us would ever experience that, not that any of us would ever have children who were prideful and selfish, but hypothetically, if you had children who were prideful and selfish, what would you do? What would be your solution to this dilemma? Well, here's what God does, and we discover his plan or his solution in Genesis chapter 12, beginning with verse 1, where the Lord calls this man named Abram. He would later on change his name to Abraham, and he would say, leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you. So we'll talk more about this in the By Faith series, but Abraham's a man who has a lot of wealth. He's built up this business, knows a lot of people, and God's like, I am starting with you. You're going to be the solution. You're going to clean up this mess, and I just want you to go. And Abraham's like, where do you want me to go? And God's like, just go. And when you go to this land, here's what's going to happen, Abraham. I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. And maybe Abraham's thinking to himself, well, I like that because I like blessing, right? We like to be blessed. And then it says that I'll make your name great. And you might be thinking, well, time out. The last time that the people on earth wanted to be great, you scattered them. And the whole situation with the Tower of Babel. God, are you sure you want to make Abraham's name great? Because it might get to his head. And God says, well, I'm going to make his name great, but it's not going to be for his own selfish purposes. It's going to be for this purpose, that Abraham and his descendants would be a blessing. In other words, you are blessed to be a blessing. God has given you riches, not so that you can hoard them, not so that you can have a happy and a healthy family, though that'd be pretty awesome if we had a happy and healthy family. But the whole purpose of it is so that you can be a blessing. You're blessed to be a blessing. To use the analogy that God gave Abraham a plate of cookies, and it wasn't so that he and his family could just enjoy the cookies, but so that he could give it away to be a blessing to the others with whom he came into contact. I had somebody after the first service who said, hey, where are the cookies? Aren't you going to give us cookies? I said, well, no, I came up with this illustration too late, so I'm not giving you cookies for all those of you who are hoping I'm going to give you a cookie. So essentially, here's God's solution when he looks at the mess at the end of Genesis chapter 11. He chooses a man, this is amazing, who's 75 years old and doesn't have any children. And he's like, you sure you got the right guy? Like, I'm an old man, we can't have kids. And God's like, yes, I got the right guy, and I'm going to use you, and I'm going to do a miracle through you for my own great purposes. And so he uses Abraham, who ends up having a son named Isaac, who has a son named Jacob. He starts with a man, and he goes to a family, who later on produces the kingdom of Israel. And out of the kingdom of Israel would come the God-man, Jesus Christ, who would be the ultimate solution to this mess, to this dysfunction. And the only one who ever lived who had zero dysfunction would provide the solution to our family dysfunction. So, when you open up the book of Matthew, this is Matthew chapter 20, Jesus knows his plan, he knows his mission, and he's walking towards Jerusalem during the feast of Passover, and he knows what his mission is. So as he's on his way, the crowds get bigger and bigger, and there's lots of people, and he pulls his disciples off to the side, and this is my paraphrase, and he huddles up with them, and he says to his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem, and when we get there, I will be betrayed, and I will be condemned by the chief priests and the religious leaders who will hand me over to the Gentiles, who will mock me, spit on me, crucify me, kill me, and 3 days later I will rise. And they have no idea what Jesus was talking about. And as he kind of has this moment of vulnerability where he opens up and he tells them clearly what his mission was, all of a sudden, the mother of these two disciples walks up to Jesus. Maybe she elbows her way and kind of works her way into this little conversation that Jesus is having. And she gets down on her knees, and you might think to yourself, well, she's probably going to worship Jesus, right? Because he's, the King of Kings, and he's the one that's going to maybe die for her sins. She doesn't end up worshiping. She says to Jesus, Jesus, I want you to do for me what I want. It's like after this incredible moment of vulnerability, she's like, I want you to hook me up. I want you to give me what I want. Jesus, when you come into your kingdom, when you become the Messiah, the King of Israel, and you kick the Romans out of here, I want one of my sons to sit on your left and one of my sons to sit on your right when you come into your kingdom. In other words, I want my boys to have places of power and authority. And Jesus looks at her and says, you don't know what you're asking for. And then he makes a statement to her that totally confuses her, and she probably just gets up and walks away, right? And then he huddles up with the disciples one more time, and he says to his disciples, you guys know that the Gentiles lord their authority over everybody else. In other words, they've been given lots of resources and power and wealth, and they leverage it for their own selfish gain. You guys know that, right? And the disciples are like, yeah, we see that every day. And Jesus looks at them and he says, not so with you. You're supposed to be different. Matter of fact, my kingdom, the kingdom of God, is going to be an upside-down kingdom. And then he says this is so good. He says, whoever wants to become great among you, you want to be great? Not just good, but great? Whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. In other words, guys, we're going in Jerusalem, and it's not about power and prestige. It is about being great, but my definition of great is completely different than the world's definition of great. If you want to be great, you'll be blessed to be a blessing. And then what Jesus would do mere days later is he would demonstrate the greatest act of love, the greatest act of servitude that has ever been done. And Jesus would preview it to them by saying, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And that's, of course, exactly what Jesus did as he went to the cross as the only non-dysfunctional human who had ever lived. And he took our place to forgive us of our sins and to provide the solution to our dysfunction. So years ago, I was in this small group with a family who has since moved away, and one of the guys in this group, who was this big burly guy with these big, thick, strong hands. One day, we were talking about family life, and he goes, I want my family to be like a castle, right? My home's like a castle with a moat around it and big, thick doors, and it's going to be a place of refuge and a place of strength where there's peace and we build each other up. And I thought, that's a really good analogy of what we want our homes to be like, where we keep the arrows out and we keep the bad things away, and it's a place of strength and a place of peace. And some of you are so good about, you have your kids' friends over, and you want that to be a healthy place for your kids to hang out. And I love that analogy that as people who want our families to be strong and peaceful and all these things we've been talking about the last several weeks, that we really should be people who are strengthening the castle. But the goal is not simply to have a peaceful, happy home and a strong castle. The goal is to armor up, because eventually you got to lead the castle, and we're called to build his kingdom, right? Eventually you got to leave the castle, and you got to make a difference for the kingdom, and you got to serve some other people, because you're blessed to be a blessing, right? You're built up to be a blessing to others. And so here's kind of what I want to talk about with the rest of this message, is that we're called to be intentional about creating opportunities for your family to bless others. Create intentional opportunities to bless other people. So I wrote an email to just a few families to see how they do this, and here's some of the responses that I got back from some folks. One person said, more is caught than taught. So live it out and ask them to do it with you. Right? So we model it first to our children, we serve, and then we say, hey, why don't you join us as we serve the church or as we serve the community? And I would even take this a step further and say sometimes you need to live it out and force them to do it with you. Right? Sometimes we just got to force them to go and to serve and to do things that we know are good for them. Somebody else wrote, our kids serve alongside us in kids ministry. They learn how to interact with children by watching us, and before long, they are role models for the kids. I think that, for all of us, as we think about our kids, we eventually want them to make this switch in their heads that I don't always just show up for church, but I am the church, right? That I'm someone who shows up every once in a while and actually serves and becomes part of what God is doing here rather than just receiving. It's good to receive, right? It's good to show up and worship and connect, but it's also good to be part of it and to bless and to be a role model. And here's the thing, if you have high school kids or maybe later middle school kids, they're some of the best role models for our children because they play the same roles as our children do, right? I don't go to school every day. Your middle school and high school kids go to school every day, so they can provide a role model for some of our younger children. This person said, it's always a blessing to serve others. It's the best way to get out of a funk. And what I like to say, it's the best way to get out of dysfunction, right? It might not feel like it in the moment, but when it's over, everyone is happier. Everyone's happier. Here's the thing. In your family, you might need some counseling. You might need some wisdom to help you with some of the struggles in your family. But what you might need more than anything is to just get out and serve, to just get out and bless somebody. And you might discover, we're out of our funk because our eyes aren't on our own problems, but we're serving other people. This person said, this is all our kids have ever known. It's what our family does, and it's who we are, which is another way of saying it's part of our culture. Right? This is just what we do. I reached out to another friend of mine who actually grew up in this church, spent 30 or 40 years in this church, and has since moved away. And I asked him, how he processes this whole thing. He said, once our child graduated out of kids ministry, it was a natural progression to volunteer with the 2-year-old class. It was built into our family's culture. We serve because Christ served us. This is who we are, and this is what we do. We don't just show up to receive, but we show up to serve. We're not just blessed by God, but we're blessed to be a blessing. Now, here's what some of you are thinking. Okay, you're like, I'm too busy. I got too much going on. I don't know if I have time for this. But the person who wrote this is one of the busiest persons I know. We can do this. We don't simply want to be busy people, as the psalmist writes, where all our busy rushing ends in nothing. Where at the end of our lives we say, we were running around doing a whole bunch of stuff, but I think I forgot to teach my kids to serve other people. Even if you like to live a busy life, which I mostly do, I don't really love sitting around and not doing anything. Even if you like to run from one thing to the next and you like to be busy, keep in mind that the goal is if you are a busy person, that all our busy rushing doesn't end in nothing, but it ends in serving, because we're doing this for a purpose. Now, I like good grades and nice plays, and that's good. When my kid pitches a good game, I'm happy about that. When your kid gets a good grade on his report card, you're happy about that. That's a good thing. That's good. But Jesus' definition of great is not that. His definition of great is that you would be a servant. When your kid comes home and he gets that first place trophy or that first place ribbon, and we celebrate that as you should. And we give them high fives and congratulate them as we should. But Jesus is saying, you know how to get first place? You know what's first place in the kingdom of God? It's when you serve. It's when you leverage whatever God's given you on behalf of other people. And Jesus demonstrated this by saying the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So maybe one of the best ways to remember this is, take care of your castle. We want our homes to be places of refuge and places of peace, right? Take care of your castle. in your church family. I mean, around here, we say just do 3 things, right? Celebrate on a Sunday, connect in a group, and serve, so that you have enough space to get out in the community and to be a blessing. So I like to say twin castles and twin tiers. Serve your castle, serve your church, and serve your community. Because that is, at the end of the day, the purpose of our family life. It's not just so that we'll have a happy and healthy home, though that is something that we strive for. The goal with parenting, the very reason that God has blessed us with a family, and the ultimate solution for all of the dysfunction in the world is Jesus, who gave everything for us. So, who should you serve? Who should you serve? Who needs to be served? Who's God strategically putting in your place? Is it a neighbor? Is it a coworker? How can you serve at your local church? How can you serve in your community? Because that is what we're called to do. I'm going to invite the worship team to come up right now, and as they're on their way up here, I want to take the remainder of this service to just bless you, okay, to speak blessing over you so that when you leave this place, you will be a little bit more inspired to serve one another. So I love this psalm. This is Psalm chapter 67, where the psalmist writes this: "May God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us." May God bless you. It's good to pray for blessing. It's good to receive the blessings of God. That your ways may be known on earth and your salvation among all nations. May the peoples praise you. O God, may all the peoples praise you. May the nations be glad and sing for joy, for you rule the peoples justly and guide the nations of the earth. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you, and then the land will yield its harvest, and God, our God, will bless us. God will bless us in all the ends of the earth. This is the purpose of blessing, right? I know you've got dysfunction in your home. I know we've all got struggles in our family life. But come on, we are so blessed. God has been so good to us. As we sang about this morning, God has provided more than we even need. He's been so good to us. And here's the purpose: that others would fear him. So strengthen your castle to build his kingdom. Let's model and let's teach to our children the importance of serving others. So in a moment, we're going to sing a song over you, but I want you to just take a moment in your seats right now for just a minute or two to just be silent before the Lord, to reflect on his goodness, to maybe pray for your kids, whether they're adult children or little children, and seek the blessing of the Lord. And then we're going to sing this song as a blessing over you before you head out to bless others. Take a moment to be silent before the Lord.